Holy Gospel according to John, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" They reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. When I was a kid, we spent all of our time either outside or in the basement. The basement was our home in the wintertime, my brothers and I, or if the weather in the summer was inclement or if our parents were away. We came up with all manner of games that we played there, including soccer. We had a little mini soccer ball. Now, we didn't have soccer goals, so we had to improvise. One of the goals was the couch. So that was a long goal, but short. And to defend it, it was easiest to be down on your knees sometimes so you could reach both ways as quickly as possible. The other goal, catty corner sort of across from the couch at the bottom of the stairs, was the laundry room door. So it was tall, but narrow. And with that, we would play soccer in the basement. And there was a time where my parents were gone, we were playing soccer, and my mom had this 1970s ceramic bluish vase that sat on one of the end tables, and the soccer ball careened across, hit that vase, it fell, and it broke. What I remember is that we glued it together feverishly, hoping we would get it done before they got home. There was a little tiny piece that was sticking out, and we got it back on the table. And it was years. We were out of the house before we finally owned up and confessed to having broken that vase. That's what I remember. But what I am certain of is that in those moments of trying to glue it back together, we were terribly stressed, and we were certainly blaming one another. I can bet it went something like, why did you kick it that way? You're the one that did this. And after blaming and yelling at each other for a little bit, we got down to the stressful time of trying to get it glued back together before they got home. I share all of this to say that sometimes, often when we are stressed, we are not our best selves. We can turn to blame and finger pointing and also just not being very nice to one another. And this is part of what I see happening in today's gospel story. Often in the Gospels, Jesus encounters people who say, Lord, have mercy. And that's not the case here. He's walking along with the disciples, and they see a man who was born blind. And they ask Jesus a question. Who sinned, him or his parents, that he was born blind? It's a question of blame. Now, I don't know if the disciples were particularly stressed at that moment. I can't imagine that following Jesus around was a whole life of certainty and pleasantry all of the time. But they asked this question about blame, and Jesus says neither. Neither of them sinned that he was born blind, but he was born that it might be for the glory of God. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and say that I do not believe God creates struggle and suffering in our lives so that God can show God's glory. Rather, all of us are wonderful, beloved, gifted children of God, through whom God's glory shines, and also that God shows up in places of suffering to be glorious and wonderful and magnificent, right? So I think Jesus is saying this guy is a beloved child of God, and God's glory can shine through him and through his situation. So Jesus spits in the mud, rubs it in the guy's eyes, brings him his sight. And this then sets off a whole string of events. I think the Pharisees and the other leaders must have been extremely stressed by Jesus' presence. We know from the arc of the Gospels that they are constantly listening to him, following him, trying to catch him in something so that they can stop him. And so they are in that place of stress, and they do not act their best selves. Rather than celebrating with this guy who newly gets his sight, they drag him in for an interrogation. As they get into this interrogation, they want to know how this happened. They want to know who did it. They want to know why this was done on the Sabbath and what the guy that did this, and they know it's probably Jesus, right? They have all these questions. And the man is just like, I don't know. I couldn't see, and now I can, and he made that happen. So then they turn to his parents. They drag them in because they don't believe he was actually born blind. Now his parents are stressed. They're stressed not necessarily because Jesus is doing what he's doing, but because they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out of the synagogue. So they will say, yes, our son was born blind, and yes, he can now see, but we don't know anything about anything else. You're going to have to ask him. Their son has just been given his sight, and instead of standing with him, they cast him out on his own. The Pharisees drag him back in and start interrogating him again. And he at some point finally just says, listen, all I know is that this guy gave me my sight. Do you want to worship him as well? And at that point, they run him out of the synagogue in anger. In all of this story, there is a lot of stress. And in that stress, the leaders aren't acting in their best selves. They're running him out, asking him questions, taking this time that perhaps could be a one of celebration and turning it into something else. His parents are not acting in their best selves either, leaving him out there to deal with the rest of it all on his own. As we are in this time of isolation and social separation, there is a great deal of stress. And some of it is shared concerns about the spread of a virus, that it might not get to us or our loved ones. Some of it is individual to our own situations. For some, this will be a stressfully financial time, or with work and all of those changes. For some, it will be difficult to be at home alone, because that has been the case all along. And now there's even more disconnection. For others, there's a bunch of little ones running around at home now while you're trying to work and cook and do all of the things that need to get done as school is being pushed into our homes in so many ways. And so with all of this, there is stress. And add on top of that anxiety and mental illness and loneliness and just all of what goes with this. And it is a stressful time for all of us. And when we are stressed, we do not always act as our best selves. Already there has been public blaming and pointing of fingers. And there will be a time where we look back and study this and figure out what could have been done better and what we can do better next time. And all of that is important. But as we get stressed and we point fingers and we lay blame, we maybe not be always in our best places. Yes, we should speak out for justice, and yes, fight for those who are struggling and marginalized in these times. But simply pointing fingers and laying blame may not be our best move, as we find the Pharisees doing that same thing on that Sabbath day. At the same time, as we are in our own homes, that stress can get to points where we may snap at one another. We may get stressed and not sleep well and forget to do things, or do things in the wrong order, or get distracted. And all of that stress can lead us to places where we are just not our best selves in these times. And that is where we find Jesus in this story. Actually beyond this story, right? He encounters these Pharisees not being their best selves, the guy's parents not being their best selves, and ultimately it is that whole group of people that will take Jesus to the cross. And on that cross, he is socially isolated. He is all by himself. On that cross, he meets us in the stress of our loneliness, the stress of our anxiety, the stress of our distractions, the stress of our snapping at one another. He meets us in our non-best selves, when we point fingers and blame and get into those places where we are mean and harmful to one another. Jesus meets us there. But he doesn't leave us there. In his death, he gathers all of that up, all of what is not our best selves. And when he comes into the resurrection, then he gives us new life. And in that new life, he gives us back our best selves so that we can live in a new and different way, even amongst the stress and terrible things that are happening around us sometimes. And it isn't even just in the resurrection. It happens in this story. From the very beginning, the man did not cry out for mercy. Jesus just walked over and gave him his sight. Later, after the man has been kicked out of the synagogue, Jesus goes and finds him. And that is the most, to me, important part of this story. Yes, he has been given his sight, but when Jesus finds him, he introduces himself as the Son of Man and says, "Do you know who I am?" And the man says, "I want to know and I want to believe." In that moment, the man really meets Jesus. Not just Jesus who gave him his sight, but Jesus who gives him a whole new life. And that is the point where this transformation occurs. And in this time where we are stressed though we may be, Jesus continues to come and find us as well. Continues to seek us out and make us whole and let us be our best selves. And amidst all of this stress, I have seen us being our best selves in so many ways. From neighbors that are helping out neighbors with supplies. For those of you that have posted comments about how you're checking on and connecting with people you haven't for a long time. for the ways our healthcare workers are out there day after day after day, long days, just trying to keep this virus at bay. The way our teachers and educators are running 100 miles an hour to try to figure out how to keep our kids learning and engaged. All of this is our best selves. This is who Jesus gifted us to be, and not just for ourselves, but for the sake of the world. I did my internship in seminary in the shadow of Columbine High School, a decade after that terrible shooting. And one of the conversations I had with my supervisor was that later on, people would come and ask him how the church had planned to respond to all of that. And he said, "You cannot plan for it, but you can be prepared." And what he meant by that was there's not a way for us to anticipate every tragedy, every crisis that can come our way, but we can prepare. And by prepare, what we can do is live in the grace of God and trust in the promises of resurrection. We can gather around the waters of this font. We can gather around the table. We can live in the space of grace and trust that resurrection life is always coming our way. And church, we are prepared. We have been all along. And we are already living into new ways of being together. It's not where we want to be, and it is not where we are going to end, but it is where we are just now, being faithful, trusting that Jesus is going to come find us the way he did that man, introduce himself again and again, and walk us into places of grace. Amen.